Hello, international finance students. Dr. Robinson. This section of lecture will talk about international corporate governance, which is actually really fascinating because for lots of reasons. I think one of the most important reasons is really, if we think about societal differences or really the things that make humanity being be varied and interesting, right? That like a lot of our fundamental conflicts come from values differences, right? And you can imagine, for example, you can have a group that puts a really strong value on personal autonomy, and another group has a really strong personal value of disgust. And so, this group says, we can't tolerate this kind of behavior that we consider strange or unusual. Whereas another group might say, that freedom is vital. And so then now we're in conflict because we have, different perceptions on what is good or important or valuable. And those kind of values, societal values, often get encoded in the type and structure of organizations that societies tolerate or permit to exist, right? So on some level, we can look at, right, the very different cultures with very different value systems and observe very different corporate and governance structures. So, if you think about, right, what's sort of uniquely or distinctly American in terms of values, and I think one thing people often point to is rugged individualism or a frontier spirit or something, like a Wild West. It's not really the world we live in now, but relative to a lot of the developed world, that is, we lean that way quite a bit. And so you can imagine, well, what does that mean for the kind of organizations that exist? We can kind of extrapolate that and say, oh, well, in the United States, I guess you would expect that probably more kinds of things are permitted to happen, and they're permitted to get sort of bigger or more powerful, and that, but also that maybe we let, that maybe there's a frontier justice aspect to how things operate. And and all of those things are very much definitely true when we think about American corporate governance relative to international. So it really is really just kind of an interesting environment to think about cultural difference in a business context. It's just like, it's like a lens. It's a lens that we can focus on and see how these play out differently. So I guess we'll start with the definition. So what are we talking when we talking about corporate governance? It's really, the whole framework, right? You've got economic, legal, institutional framework that all of, I guess all of economic opportunity operates in, but really in particular, this becomes most relevant when you have large organizations, right? If I have my own business and the only person employed in it is me, I don't necessarily have to carefully set up structures so that I don't, treat myself poorly or take advantage of myself, or right, because it's all internal to me, things end up very aligned, right? Like if I want to do something and I choose to do it, it's going to, by definition, be in my best interest because I'm the only person involved, right? But when there are millions of people, this does not hold anymore, right? So I guess the text describes the central problem of corporate governance is how to best protect outside investors from expropriation by the controlling insiders. And that doesn't apply when it's all the same person, right? You can't really expropriate from yourself, but certainly you could from a large group, right? If there's thousands of people that are involved in this thing and one person decides to do something that selfishly benefits them at the expense of everyone else, Well, they shouldn't be allowed to do that probably, but what are the systems that prevent that from happening? And you can get away with no system when it's just you, and you can get away with, probably some kind of reputation-based system when it's a small team that are close friends or that are family. But when you have an organization of millions, you can't rely on those kind of systems, and you need much more formalized structures. And also, you're dependent on the legal system in the country that you're operating in to support you in enforcing the policy, and that is can be very context dependent. This just came out, but basically the state of California, it was never really particularly enforceable. Like having a I guess NDAs weren't very enforceable in California, but now the non-competes doing a non-compete agreement is significantly reduced in efficacy in California with a recent policy change. And so that matters a lot for a couple different directions, right? If you hire someone, they can just work for a different company that's very, very similar to yours very quickly. So it makes it harder to invest in employees, but also that makes it easier as an employee to commit to a company because you're not risking your future in the entire industry when you sign up. So there's a lot of complexity to the effects a lack of enforceability of non-competes could have within an industry. And that's just, one example. There could be tons that we could think about that all fit within this umbrella. So we will have these formal systems that really serve to protect the minority interests in large organizations, specifically because they're the interests at risk for being expropriated. It's very interesting because there's, if you think about this, is really kind of the language and structure we think about when we talk about, like a systemic oppression or, right, or, if you think about minority groups that are at structural disadvantages, it's a lot harder to try to think about being like having these kind of issues if you are the dominant faction, because if you're the dominant faction, what's stopping you? Right? There's nothing. Well, unless you're oppressing yourself or something, it doesn't. It's hard to imagine a very clear path to ending up being in a position where you're being expropriated when you're in charge, right? But when you're a minority, if we think, and right, so we often talk about this in ethnic minorities where you're not in a position of power, so then you are in a position to have your labor expropriated or having your culture exploited or whatever. That thinking translates over into an investment context where you have minority shareholders who have maybe a vote or have some influence, but really are to a great degree subject to the legal systems protecting them from bad behavior by, the driver with the keys and the wheel, right? And in environments where that doesn't work very well, then you can imagine and can expect to see a lot more bad behavior by the dominant faction or the faction in charge, right? So in a corporate context, that's often the executive team, the management team, major shareholders, right? But the same kind of sort of, thinking we can think about in, in a structural oppression context from, in an ethnic one can often translate directly over from a minority shareholder perspective. It's just the minority shareholders aren't defined by ethnicity, it's defined by ownership. So it's, some things poured over great, some things don't make sense at all. So this, it's that's all sort of interesting and mixed together. So in general, we focus most, or governance is most important for public corporations because those are the biggest ones. So again, a public corporation is a corporation it has shares of stock. Those shares trade on a public stock exchange. It can be owned by literally anybody who has money. And so there's a couple features that make governing public corporations particularly difficult. Or you have a multitude of shareholders protected by limited liability, right? So they they often are just buying secondhand shares from someone else who contributed capital. And so they're not actively involved in the business and don't really have influence in it of it other than the votes their shares have. And that's in a stark contrast with management, which has a lot of control over the operations of the firm and possibly little economic interest, right? If I'm a brand new CEO, I may not own any shares in the company. I have a compensation package, which might include salary and bonus, but I don't. That doesn't necessarily align me with the interests of the shareholders. We'll talk about more of that later. But you have kind of this separation, right, where the people that own it aren't the people running it, and that introduces potential for conflict and disagreements on the proper management of the organization in question. And these are large, vast entities, and so innovation or lack thereof or negative, developments have huge economic consequences. Could involve thousands of or millions of people. And it's these few, these organizations, the large public organizations, that really drive economic growth and capitalism worldwide for hundreds of years. But right now, if you look at productivity growth in the United States and GDP growth, it's really, really driven in the main by a few large tech companies, and everybody else is just sort of treading water. And so it's these really large public organizations that have a huge sway over the economic outcomes for people in their country, right? If you think about, like regular, like normal run-of-the-mill people that have jobs and safe retirement, though they're quite likely working for a large organization like this and have investments that are in these large organizations that they don't have control of and probably don't vote. And so, right, the little people, right, have very little influence, and so they rely on systems to protect them. So that's why thinking about those systems is really important. So we think about a public corporation relative to other forms of organization. The big, so we've got some positives and negatives, some strengths and weaknesses, right? So ability to spread and share risk is huge, right? If you think about, for example, like a Tesla or a SpaceX, where we launch a whole bunch of satellites to provide, internet globally, wirelessly and globally. This is a very uncertain adventure that could, result in huge investments that don't work out, right? And so the ability to spread that risk over millions of people is a huge advantage of a public corporation. Related to that, right? So there's always, almost two sides of the coin, right? So you get this diversity of risk sharing, but at the same time, that's also diffusion of responsibility. And so to solve that, responsibility gets concentrated in a managerial class, right? In professional managers, but their interests aren't necessarily aligned with the shareholders. So the primary source of conflict actually is that the number one thing managers love to do is to keep their job, right? And keeping their job is often looks like, well, I want to do enough innovation to look like I'm innovating and no more, right? It's sort of a window dressing version of innovation, where true innovation is quite a bit riskier. And if they boldly step into a new business and have it fail, then they're likely to get fired. Where if they didn't boldly do anything, they may just be able to coast and be fine, right? So So the diffusion of responsibility directly feeds into a conflict of interest between managers and shareholders, and then can naturally stifle innovation. And if we think about the really innovative large companies in our modern era, they tend to have strong personalities, right? Steve Jobs at the head of Apple, Jeff Bezos at the head of Amazon, um, and Elon Musk at Tesla and SpaceX, and Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, right? And that's in contrast with maybe Google, or Microsoft, where the founders have stepped away, and it the Microsoft is executing excellently, and they are very profitable, and their revenues are growing very rapidly, but a lot of that is directly related to cloud services, which they weren't the pioneer on. That was Amazon, and right, they have a social network, LinkedIn, that they just bought, and they have they were an investor partner with OpenAI, but that was partly just a consequence of wanting to compete with Google. So there's not a lot of things at Microsoft that you can point to and say, oh wow, this is a bold, dramatic, bet the company kind of move that panned out or didn't. Right? That's not really the kind of thing they're doing. And so and that's can basically be a result of that. Also, so we have public corporations can raise a ton of money quickly, right? You just sell more shares, you can get a lot of money. And that's really important for the kind of businesses that require money. Now, increasingly, our businesses look less like buy big thing, run thing for a while. It's often more like your business grows, and as it grows, it needs more people and more resources. And so, in a manufacturing context, there tends to be lots of upfront costs with lower fixed costs. I mean, and lower, and whereas, in more modern, like in the tech sector or just things, I think nowadays things look less like that and more like, scaling expenses as businesses grow, with the huge outlays being the exception rather than the rule. But obviously, auto manufacturing, right? So SpaceX and Tesla both have huge capital needs up front. Also, AI is that way, right? You have to, spend the $1 billion training the model, and then hopefully utilize it for financial success. So you get this access to tons of capital. It's a big advantage of a public corporation. But with a weakness, there's because there's tons of access to capital. Companies can limp along for a long time without necessarily being very successful, right? You can just raise money instead. And the shareholders, the diverse set of shareholders, right? To get the big capital, right, we have to draw from a very large pool. And because the pool is very large, no individual person can pick up the mantle and monitor management. And so you get sort of diffuse ownership that can't really enforce their will effectively on management, and that leads to, drift and expropriation. Right? If I'm a huge corporation, I can hire the best managers, right? I get the best expertise there is. I can pay very good wages and draw from, really, really competent people. But at the same time, we have this, right? So because we're really big, we can afford to hire really competent management, but at the same time, that management that's really competent might also be a controlling shareholder, part of a controlling shareholder family, and then now the fact that management is connected up with sort of, the dominant faction means that small outside shareholders can be exploited unless there's strong legal protections against it. So what we're getting at fundamentally is there's an agency problem, meaning that the shareholders must delegate decision-making authority to the managers. They're not good at and or can't make those decisions themselves. And that this inherently creates a problem because the decision-making authority is resting with a group, the managers, that have different interests than the shareholders do. And so we can think about all sorts of ways to try to align the desires of management to be matched up with the desires of shareholders. But that requires thought and care and design and, policy potentially. So, right. And so the clearest way to think about that is to think about looking at a short-term best interest of the manager versus a long-term best interest of the shareholder. So, a classic example would be the acquisition of a sports team. So, right, maybe the manager is very interested in football and they really like it, and they want it to be part of the corporate portfolio because they want to be able to, exert some influence over the team and, be able to attend games in a skybox and justify it as part of their managerial labor, right? So you can imagine how this would all be very, very selfishly beneficial to a manager, but that the actual returns to owning a sports team might be negative or low, right? And so, right, the minority shareholders aren't benefiting from the sports team in the way that the manager is benefiting from the sports team. But right, the manager is in charge, and so unless someone prevents them from doing the sports team purchase, they might, just might do it, and then negatively affect overall organizational value, which is, in the main borne by these small shareholders, right? So this is the kind of behavior that we have to think about from a corporate governance perspective of preventing, right? So, so they can, right, do. Then there's lots and lots of ways for managers to take advantage of the firm, right? Waste funds, transfer pricing, so, right, maybe the company is buying, they're licensing intellectual property from a different organization, which is also controlled by the parent. So the location of the profits between the organizations is somewhat arbitrary, right? If we can charge ourselves a high price or a low price, and if managers have differential ownership in the different parts of the chain, right, they might selfishly allocate more profit to the parts of the chain that they have a stronger economic interest in, and that just straight benefits them personally. And right, so there's lots of potential avenues for abuse. So we have unprofitable projects that personally benefit themselves. That would be like the sports team example. Exorbitant perquisites like private jets or vacation properties or executive loans, that kind of thing. And then also very important to governance are anti-takeover measures. So if we put some policies in place that make it really hard for the firm to be purchased, that can be a bummer for shareholders because often when firms are purchased, there's a big jump in price. So they get a big bump in the value of their shares. But often management is fired. So they would like to block that from happening for their own self-interest, but it goes against the wishes of shareholders typically. And so there's, some tension there, like maybe to get the really good manager, you have to tolerate a little bit of that, or they won't feel secure enough upon arrival, or maybe you don't tolerate it and they just have to deal, right? So, but this is obviously just one of those situations where the manager would love to block all takeovers, and shareholders would like to allow every possible takeover under the sun, generally. I mean, there might be exceptions to that, but But yeah, they're not right. Those incentives aren't really aligned, so you have to negotiate. They have to negotiate where everything lands between them. Okay, so when we come back, we'll talk about how this agency problem gets addressed.